organize teams to sort through the remaining supplies and start building permanent structures. His interest in Earth architecture, once a source of annoyance to his pragmatic father, had enabled Wells to design the 3 wooden cabins that now stood in the center of the clearing. Wells glanced up at the darkening sky. He'd give anything to have the Chancellor see the cabins eventually, not to prove a point. After seeing his father shot on the launch deck, Wells's resentment had drained faster than the color from the Chancellor's cheeks. Now he only wished his father would someday get to call Earth home. The rest of the colony was supposed to join them once conditions on Earth were deemed safe, but 21 days had passed without so much as a glimmer from the sky. As Wells lowered his eyes back to the ground, his thoughts returned to the task at hand, saying farewell to the boy they were about to send to a much darker resting place. A girl next to him shivered. "Can we move this along?" she said. "I don't want to stand out here all night." "Watch your tone," another girl named Kendall snapped, her delicate lips drawn into a frown. At first, Wells had assumed she was a fellow Phoenician, but he'd eventually realized that her haughty stare and clipped cadence were just an impression of the girls Wells had grown up with. It was a fairly common practice among young Waldenites and Arcadians, although he'd never met anyone who did it quite as well as Kendall. Wells turned his head from side to side, searching for Graham, the only other Phoenician aside from Wells and Clarke. He didn't generally like letting Graham take control of the group, but the other boy had been friends with Asher and was better equipped than Wells to speak at his funeral. However, his was one of the few faces missing from the crowd, aside from Clarke's. She'd set off right after the fire with Bellamy to search for his sister, leaving nothing but the memory of the 5 toxic words she'd hurled at Wells before she left. "You destroy everything you touch." A crack sounded from the woods, unleashing gasps from the crowd. Without thinking, Wells pulled Molly behind him with one arm and grabbed a shovel with the other. A moment later, Graham stepped into the clearing, flanked by 2 Arcadians, Azuma and Dimitri, and a Walden girl named Leela. The 3 boys were carrying armfuls of wood, while Leela had a few branches tucked under her arm. "So that's where the other axes went," a Waldenite named Antonio said, eyeing the tools slung over Azuma's and Dimitri's shoulders. "We could have used those this afternoon, you know." Graham raised an eyebrow as he surveyed the newest cabin. They were finally getting the hang of it. There were no gaps in the roof this time, which meant it would be much warmer and drier at night. None of the structures had windows, though. They were too time-consuming to cut, and without access to glass or plastic, they would be little more than gaping holes in the walls. "Trust me, this is more important," Graham said, raising the pile of wood in his arms. "Firewood?" Molly asked. She flinched as Graham snorted. "No, spears. A few wooden shacks aren't going to keep us safe. We need to defend ourselves. The next time those bastards show up, we'll be ready." His eyes settled on Asher, and an unfamiliar expression flitted across Graham's face. His customary veneer of anger and arrogance had cracked, revealing something like real grief. "Do you want to join us for a minute?" Wells asked, softening. "I thought we'd say a few words for Asher. You knew him well, so maybe you'd like to." "It seems like you have everything under control," Graham cut him off, avoiding Asher's body as he met Wells's eyes. "Carry on, Chancellor." By the time the sun had fully set, Wells and Eric were placing the final shovelfuls of dirt on the new grave, while Priya wrapped flowers around the wooden marker. The rest of the group had drifted away, either to avoid watching the actual burial or to stake out a spot in one of the new cabins. Each could fit about 20 comfortably. 30 if people were too tired or too cold to complain about errant legs sprawled across their mound of charred blankets, or the odd elbow to the face. Wells was disappointed, though not surprised, to discover that Leela had once again claimed one of the cabins for Graham and his friends, leaving the younger kids shivering in the cold as they looked warily around the shadow-filled clearing. Even with volunteer guards keeping watch, no one left outside was in for a restful night. "Hey," Wells said as Graham strode past carrying one of his partially completed spears, "since you and Dimitri are taking the second guard shift, why don't you 2 sleep outside? It'll be easier for me to find you when my shift's over." Before Graham could respond, Leela sauntered up and hooked her arm through his. "You promised you'd stay with me tonight, remember? I'm too afraid to sleep on my own," she said, affecting a breathy, high-pitched voice that was a far cry from her usually snapping tone.